So 5 years into pastoral ministry for me, I began to understand that God had built me to be a counselor. And 5 years later, I had a master's degree and a doctorate degree, and I was ready to go and practice what I learned. And that's when I came to this church. So I began to counsel people in this church. And on my day off, I began to counsel people on my day off, people from outside the church. I didn't know how any of that was going to go. But 14 years later, it was clear to me that God was leading me to do counseling full time, like every hour of every day. And there was a bit of a struggle in that moment. I couldn't see the path forward to that. There were a number of details that needed to work out, and I didn't want to leave my church where I worked here. And it felt like God was leaving me to figure out all the details of how this was going to work. And at that moment, I went to a retreat, and I was bunking up with another pastor at that retreat as a pastor's retreat. And I'll never forget it. I was sitting on my bunk, he's sitting on his bunk, and he said, "Vinnie, why don't you try this?" I said, "Okay. When I go back home, I'm going to try what you said." So I had a plan. And that night, something happened that I don't know has ever happened to me before. A dark figure came to me in my sleep, looked a lot like a demon to me, and was grabbing at my legs and at my feet. And it was so real that I was shaking my legs, I was kicking the bedpost, and I woke up and I looked around and I was like, what just happened? And I looked over to see if that other pastor had gotten woken up. I was like, what just happened? I was sure that night I talked to him, I was supposed to take that step that he told me I should take, but now I was wondering, what is going on here? I didn't know what to make of that night. And I bet that someone in here has had an experience like that. Something that you didn't know what to make of. A time where you couldn't see the path forward. It felt like God left you to figure out all the details of something. You probably felt God forsaken. Maybe it felt dark. Maybe it felt like something was trying to pull you under. And those nights can feel really empty. You can feel abandoned. You can feel alone. Last Sunday's sermon text came from Jacob in the Old Testament. And Jacob felt all those things that you and I felt in our situations. Walter Moody last week spoke about Jacob's life a little bit farther along where he wrestled with God. I'm going to take you back in his life to another time where he essentially was wrestling with himself and what he had done. Jacob is leaving his home in Beersheba, and he's going to a place called Haran. And it's interesting because he's on the run going to Haran. He stole the blessing from his brother, who was the oldest. He stole it by tricking his dad into giving it to him because his dad was blind. And this was tearing the family apart. Esau, his brother, wanted to kill him a lot like Cain and Abel before them. And his mother sent Jacob away to go to his uncle Laban. And we find Jacob here 2 days into his journey. He's gotten 60 miles in the journey. He's got 500 left to go. He's probably already exhausted and vulnerable. And I bet he's unsure what's going to happen next. And that's where we come to Genesis 28 in verse number 10. If you have one of the Bibles from underneath the seat, every other seat has a Bible if you want to grab it. This is page 22 in that Bible. If you have your own Bible, it's Genesis 28, verse 10. Also, there's a thing in the bulletin called the Take Home. If you take that out, the scriptures are listed there. We'll also put them on the screen for you. Page 22 in our Bible, Genesis 28:10. I want you to look as we engage the scripture today. I want you to be engaged as we read it. So I want to ask you to look for some surprising moments. What are some moments that if you were Jacob, you would not have expected to happen in this moment? It says in verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and he went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and he stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. Now, I want you to notice that the writer here doesn't even give this place a name, just says it's a certain place. The sun's setting, he has no choice but to stop here. And if you know anything about Jacob, Jacob's a mama's boy. He spent his time in the house while Esau spent his time out in the field hunting and all these things. Jacob's used to being in the house. He's used to being comfortable. And here he is. Here's his pillow. Mama's boy, right? So Jacob is clearly in survival mode. But look at what happens next in the text, Genesis 28 and verse 12. He dreamed, and this is the scripture's way of getting our attention, and behold, pay attention, look at this. There was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top reached to the heaven, and behold, there it is again, the angels of God. See them, see the angels of God. They're ascending and descending on this ladder. So Jacob sees something familiar. You and I don't see these, but they're called ziggurats. And the Canaanites of that area made these things for their religion. But this one that Jacob sees is not man-made. This one is God-made, and there's real traffic coming on that thing that looks like a ziggurat. There's angels coming and going. And here in the middle of nowhere, the heavens are open for Jacob. Earlier in Genesis, you'll remember there's this thing called the Tower of Babel. This tower that the people made because they wanted to ascend and be like God. That's humanity trying to climb up and make our way to God or to make ourselves God. But this place is about God coming down. God coming down. God coming down to Jacob. I don't know what people have called you in your life. I've been called different things in my life. Jacob was called a deceiver because that's what he did. God shows up for Jacob, the deceiver. And yet, that's not the greatest surprise. It's not the ladder either, but it's who stands on that ladder. Genesis 28:13. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, his grandfather, the God of Isaac, his father. The land on which you lie, I will give you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. If you're wondering why Israel is such an important territory, this text tells you why. God promised something, and God's going to deliver on that. But that's a sidebar. Today, I'm looking at God's nearness. I want you to see how near God is here. God is not shouting from heaven's balcony down to Jacob. He is standing literally beside Jacob in the wilderness. The Hebrew language has a way of saying this that says God was beside him in this moment. Every promise flows from this nearness of God. I am with you. I will keep you. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you. And if you know Jacob's story, you know that's important because he's going to spend the next 14 years working really hard for his uncle Laban. He's going to be mistreated. The deceiving that Jacob did, the sowing that he did there, he's going to reap that back with his uncle. And he needs to know that God is going to be with him in the next 14 years. In this very place where Jacob felt most alone, what does God say? God says, you're not abandoned. You're not forgotten. I am right here. And 30 years ago, when I read this text, where I remember reading it for the first time, it wasn't the first time I read it, but that's when I think about reading it for the first time. This is what most stood out to me, and this is what most stands out to me today as I read it again. Genesis 28 and verse 16 now. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place." And I did not know it. When we sing that song, The House of the Lord, we're singing Jacob's song. He was afraid, and he said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other," listen to it, "than the house of God." The house of God. And this is the gate of heaven. Just as I woke up from my dream shook, Jacob wakes up from this dream shook. He realizes that he wasn't alone after all with his rock for a pillow. God was in this very place that he thought was empty. What looked like survival ground was not survival ground. It was sacred ground for Jacob. Genesis 28 in verse 18 says, "So early the next morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up for a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of the city was Luz at the first." So that place that the person says was a certain place, it actually had a name. They just called it a certain place. This is a random, ordinary place, not a special place. But Jacob names it, he marks it, he consecrates it. He calls it Bethel, the house of God. This pillow of discomfort that he slept on became a pillar of his devotion to God, but also, more importantly, God's devotion to him, that I will not leave you. And that place that he thought was nothing became a place that he would never forget. And I bet some of you are in a place like that, or you've been in a place like that. You wish you could forget it, but now you can't forget it because God showed up for you. But what do we see in Jacob's story? The thing that I see in Jacob's story is this: God takes up residence in the places where you would least expect him to show up. And he turns that place into holy ground. That's what I saw 30 years ago when I read this text. God shows up for his people. Jacob doesn't leave that night unchanged. The ground itself is changed. And Jacob will come back to this place later in his journey, and he will reaffirm, this is Bethel. Isn't that how God works? We want to forget these places, but they become places for us to remember because we can see that God was there. You're probably what ended up happening with my demon story, right? Looking back now, I can see it more clearly. That night, I was at a place called Towanipi Campground. And yes, that's a real name. No wonder I had a dream at something nipping at my toes, right? That very night, I thought God left me to figure things out. I had already made a decision that night that would set the course of God's will for my life, what God had asked me to do to step out in faith. At that time, I honestly felt shaken, like Jacob in the wilderness, wondering, where is God in all this? But in hindsight, I can see that he was there asking me to take a leap of faith. And that place that felt so dark to me turned out to be holy ground as I look back now. Here's the thing. The place that you thought was dark or confusing could be a Bethel for you too. Could be that for you too. So what does this mean for us? What are we supposed to do with this? What I see here is that the God of covenant, he refuses to let our worst decisions or our hardest seasons or our loneliest nights go unused. He'll use them. He will turn them into holy ground for us. So what do we do with this? Well, Jacob does some things, and I'm going to point to some of the things I noticed that he did. There's some other things in the text you might see as well, and those are probably important too, but I'm just going to focus on 5 of them. And I'm also going to tell you 5 stories along the way to give them some more color, to bring it to life for today for us. So the first thing that you can do is that you can name that moment. You can call it what it is, holy ground. Don't let it slip by just as a certain place. Someone once told me about a time that they nearly died as a child because the person that was supposed to be watching them stepped out for a minute at just the wrong moment, and this person was terrified, and they wondered for a few moments there if they were going to die. Years later, they thought about that memory, and as they were sitting with the Lord, they saw something unexpected. They saw that Jesus was there. What had always felt like a moment of abandonment became something else. It was a place where God showed up for them. They had always been filled with fear whenever they thought of that, but now they started to see it as holy ground. God was there with them. God protected them in that moment. Is there a part of your story that you have buried way down deep? You don't want anybody to see it because it seems too random, it seems too painful, it's just too much. What if God is inviting you to name it? Not as a scar to hide. I've got some scars on my body, and most of the time I've tried to hide them, plastic surgery or whatever. But what if this could be a place where God actually stood by you? So you name it. You say, God was with me in that moment. You ask him, Lord, where were you in that moment? And you sit with him until you get an answer. That's what the Psalms are, most of them are about. About 2/3 of them are laments. They're, Lord, where are you in my experience? And the psalmist keeps singing that song until God shows up for them. So you can name it. After you name it, there's something else you can do. Number 2, you can mark it. And this reminds me of a woman that shared an experience with me, and it seems so small on the surface. She invited a friend to sit with her one day, like out in the sun. It was a woman who was going through a very difficult time, and she thought maybe I could just be with this person. And that's what they did. It was quiet, it was warm, it was peaceful. They didn't say much, they just sat there together. But for the woman who did the inviting, something happened. It was the first time in her journey that she could look back on a difficult experience in a difficult season, and she could say, the Good Shepherd was with me in this moment. She could sense God's presence, the Good Shepherd, after a long season of pain. And she did something important. She wrote it in her journal in black and white so she could come back to it at any time to see this moment that God showed up for her. And I think about me, I think about you, how quick we are to move on from moments like that. Sometimes we don't mark it and then we forget about it. And then we wonder if we can trust God in our current situation because we haven't named and marked that moment where God was with us. But what if some of those moments that you've had are Bethel moments? You can name them and you could mark them. Don't let these moments pass by. Maybe you write them down. Maybe you tell the story to other people to encourage them. You see, the more that you share it, the more likely you are to remember it yourself. You can set up your own pillar of some sort. Like I have different things around my house that remind me of moments where God showed up. You could do that too. These are reminders that God's still walking with us now. I don't know if you understand this old hymn that we sing here every once in a while. It says, "Here I raise my Ebenezer. Hither by thy help I've come." Do you know what that Ebenezer thing is? In the scripture, an Ebenezer is just a stone of remembrance. I raise my Ebenezer. That's what Jacob did. He put that rock there to say, when I come back here and I see that rock, it's going to remind me that God was here and he helped me. Every time you mark a moment like that, you're raising your own Ebenezer, a reminder that the Lord has carried you this far and he's not going to leave you. So you name it, you mark it with a B. Is that how you do it? You name it, mark it with a, that's a kid's song. Never mind. You guys don't know that song? You guys aren't old enough. All right. So you name it, you mark it, and then the next thing that I saw here in the text is that you reframe it. What does it mean to reframe? Well, see, God was present there even though he didn't know it. There was a man who told me about a deep regret that he had. He had this really good friend, and things didn't go so well with the friend. At the end of their friendship, they parted ways. And for the rest of his life, this guy thought that this was my fault that this friendship went south. And something happened to his friend died, and so now this man felt responsible in some way for his friend's death, and he carried that with him for many years. But as he began to listen to the voice of the Lord about this, he began to see that the pain in that person's life preceded his relationship with that person. That person was carrying all this pain, and that was the reason for their death later. It wasn't because of what this man had done or said. And more than that, he began to see how God carried him through that season of finding out about the loss of an old friend, and how God had walked with him through the guilt of that to a place of grace. You know, some of us have memories like that man that we would like to erase, if we're honest, right? We want to erase them. But what if God doesn't want you to erase them? What if he wants to rewrite them? Not by changing what happened, because what happened, happened, but by changing what it means. And this is something I get to see every day that I work with people. Their memories don't change, but what their memories mean start to change. And reframing isn't like, oh, I'm going to deny the pain ever happened. No, it's God redeeming that pain. It's God buying that pain back. It's God making something of that pain. It's revealing the presence of God even in that moment. Joseph in the Old Testament is a great example of this. What does he say when his brothers come to him later in life and they had basically thrown him under the bus many years or decades earlier? He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And Joseph understood that God has a way to redeem things. The New Testament says that all things work together for the good of those who love God. And that's what's happening here with Jacob. Now, I have to pause here because I know there's someone here saying, I can't name it. I can't mark it. I can't reframe it. I'm in the middle of it, Vinnie. What do we do with that? Well, this one's for you. Number 4, you worship in it. You worship in it. Don't wait till later to worship. You can worship now. This reminds me of a woman who went through a time of broken trust in her marriage, and then one day there was this small disappointment with her husband. And that small disappointment started to make her spiral because it brought up all these feelings of unworthiness. But instead of falling apart, she just took a moment, she paused, and she remembered something simple that she had done earlier that day. She had a friend, she went over to that friend's house, and she delivered a gift to that friend and left a note with it. And that moment that she wrote that note became a pillar for her, a moment with God that she could remember and carry forward with her. So she said, Lord, in this moment when I want to fight with my husband, when I want to run from him, I'm going to remember that note of kindness that I wrote for my friend. And she rehearsed that and sang a song about that and kept working with that until the Lord showed her how to be kind to her husband in that moment. You might be wondering why I told that story talking about worship. Because worship is literally honoring God in the mundane things of everyday life. And this was a moment where she chose to worship God, where she chose to ask God for help, and where God showed up. Maybe you're waiting for the storm to pass before you lift your hands in worship. But let's be honest that some of our most honest worship happens in the middle of our messes. While it's going on. You don't have to wait to worship. You can pray, you can praise, you can give thanks now. You can turn an ordinary moment, a painful moment, into a sanctuary with the Lord. So how can you worship right here, right in your moment that you're going through stuff? And that leads me to the last thing I see here in the story. You see, the Lord wants us to leave these situations changed by them. That's why he allows them. That's why he ordains them. So could you leave today changed? Could you leave different today? Could you say God was with me all along? There was a man that I knew. He stood at the edge of life itself. He didn't know if he could go on another day. and he couldn't feel God in that moment, couldn't see the way forward. But now today, as he looks back on these moments, he tells a different story. He says, Jesus didn't just find me. Jesus sat with me in the dark. He walked away from that season, this man, not just alive, but he left changed from that moment. He had this old narrative of I'm alone, but now this became a testimony of God was with me all along. You see, Jacob left Bethel with a new path. He left with a new identity. And he really knew that he wasn't alone. Right? There's one thing to know you're not alone, and there's another thing to know you're not alone. They're two different knowings. One's a head knowledge, and one's a heart knowledge, an experiential knowledge. And that's what God wants to give you today, an experiential knowledge of him. Maybe you've walked through a valley like that. What if on the other side you could say, surely the Lord was in this place, and I didn't know it? What if you could leave changed by that? What if this could transform you, how you see yourself, how you see God? But of course, all 5 of these things we cannot do on our own. We can't do by ourselves. You say, why is that the case? Well, let's go back to Babel. We tend to build our own towers of Babel, not like literal towers, but our own towers. Like God, look at how hard I've worked. God, look at how good I've tried to be. God, look at how hard I've worked, how much I've done. But these are like towers of Babel. What did God do with the Tower of Babel? We haven't gotten there yet here at church? I think it's in Genesis, so you should have gotten there by now. The tower came down. The tower collapsed, right? God's answer isn't for us to climb higher. His answer in Bethel is to come down to us. He came down to Jacob in a dream. He came down to Israel in the form of a tabernacle. He came down ultimately in Jesus, in the body of a human being. John says the Word, Jesus, became flesh. And we beheld his glory. Eugene Peterson paraphrased that. Jesus moved into the neighborhood. If you literally translate it, you would probably say Jesus tabernacled among us. The tabernacle came down here. In John 1:51, Jesus says, you, disciples, will see the heaven open and the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So what Jesus told the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he said, all the scriptures are about me. Here's one proof of that. This ladder was pointing to Jesus, pointing forward to Jesus. Jesus is the ladder. Jesus is the real Bethel. He bridges heaven and earth himself. The cross is the ultimate Babel, right? We don't expect to see God show up there at an execution, but that's where God shows up. And then God shows up in the resurrection, where that stone is rolled away from the tomb and Jesus walks out triumphant. See, the resurrection is where this stone of death becomes a memorial to life. I don't know if you noticed this, but the reason I have this rock in the first place, it's actually the shape of a heart. So this story about Jacob is about God's love for Jacob, Jacob's descendants. And guess what? You're part of that. You've been grafted in to Israel because we've been grafted into that tree. The blessings that God has for the Jewish people. We're Gentiles. Most of us aren't Jewish. We've been grafted into these blessings in a way. So if Jesus really is our ladder, the one who came down, that means something for your darkest nights. That one place in your story that you thought was empty, but today you can name it, you can mark it, you can reframe it, you can worship in it, and then you can leave changed by it, just like Jacob did. It's going to give you a moment to sit with that. The worship team's going to come and play some music softly, just ask the Lord, what does this mean for you? What's one thing you can take with you?